don't think about how hard that is. When you think about how hard people work to raise this money in the first place, the value on it is absolutely huge. So greater accountability and tackling waste and spending is coupled with all of this. But in general, any measure that gets people more aware of where their money goes, the challenge, and makes people more aware of, there's a disconnect with politics in many respects, and sometimes people will say, "Oh, why am I paying that tax to ye?" As in, it's us up here who just get it and keep it. To make people aware of the challenges that the minister and all other ministers in the cabinet face on a daily basis, and there's. To explain, even as I regularly say to constituents that I meet, leave aside the bank debt and the huge problems we have there and the mistakes that were made in the past. Just park that for a minute. Our difficulty in this country, bar none, is our deficit. And the fact, you wouldn't run a household the way this country has been run for a number of years, and that we're spending more than we're taking in. And as a government, we would be absolutely, totally irresponsible if we didn't tackle that deficit and try and close that gap as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it's the future generations that will pay for us continuing to borrow to fund very basic services on that way. But to make people aware of that challenge that the government faces every single day in trying to do the right thing by the country, getting it back on its feet, and the key role that they play in that. So in that regard, again, I'd like to commend the bill to the House and Deputy Murphy for his work on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Deputy Humphrey.
Thank you very much. And can I first of all to thank Deputy Murphy for putting the bill before the House. I think we're having an interesting debate. I haven't been quite able to follow every piece because the Finance Committee is meeting all morning. I think making this kind of information available to the citizen will enable us to have a proper debate when we're talking. And in the last number of days and weeks, I've been meeting various groups and individuals in relation to the budget. And when I've sat down and I've talked to them about the size of the pie and how we divide it, and asked them for their inputs, because normally when you meet groups or individual citizens, they're asking you not to allow the cut in their particular area. But then when you say to, well, if we don't make a savings, or if we increase the spending in this particular area, we're going to have to decrease our expenditure elsewhere. And then you ask them, where would they make the saving? Or where would they increase the spending? I had a very interesting debate with pupils from one of my local schools where they arrived in, and we discussed education. And we looked at the education budget in the last year and the savings, and especially the cut that unfortunately, or the rebalancing as far as the career guidance teachers were concerned. And I explained the finance, I explained the government's position, and a debate from 16-year-old young ladies, and a very informed debate. And they could see the decisions that has to be made by their elected politicians, and they bought into the process. And at the end of that discussion, one of the teachers got up and says, "But you shouldn't have made us any savings as far as career guidance." And I explained to the teacher presenters, I just explained to the pupils, this is the pie, this is how much we have, and these are the areas. And a young lady stuck her hand up and said, "I have another question." And I says, "Fire ahead." She says, "Deputy, it's not for you, it's for me teacher." And said to the teacher, says, "Where would you have made the cuts? Where would you have made the spendings, and how would you have spent the money? We're after spending a half an hour of it being explained. Give us the alternative viewpoint." And the teacher says, "Well, I wouldn't have made them in education." And that young lady says, "That's a bit of a cop-out, miss. I told the pupil not to be too concerned about our Christmas marks. I don't think they're going to be too good." But I found that encouraging and enlightening. There was a young lady of 16 years, able to take in the decisions that are being made in this House. And when we put it in a factual way, a 16-year-old can look at the choices and the difficulties we have. And many sectors in society only sees their limited area. So, as Councillor Murphy laid out, the individual earning the 42,000 and you split it down, how each area has gone. That transparency, I believe, is good, it's excellent, but we need to be careful how we do it. Because, like, the example of the environment is a good example, but as was said earlier on, there will be expenditures through taxation and local government, and that has to be explained. I think Deputy Murphy covered it well in the speech. The only concern is the resources that we'd have to do is posting it out. And I think Deputy Murphy has come across the solution himself by talking about an online solution or an app in those areas. And the way that could be managed, that we have a post out on our P21s. And what we could do there is information on how you contact and how you see your breakdown of how taxation is spent. And as I go back to that young lady, 16 years of age, when it was explained, they got it. And I believe the vast majority of taxpayers will get it because they want a society that functions. And it would be an ideal area to focus in on some of the waste we have. And I just mention in conclusion, the €5,000 being published. I think 5,000 should be the target we work for. And I think that is, but we should look at it incremental. So maybe the first is 15,000 the first year, 10,000 the third year, and 5,000 to allow our systems to get up to speed to allow that to happen. I welcome the Minister's speech earlier on, and again, thank you, Deputy Murphy, for allowing this debate. I apologise for not being able to follow it to the detail, and if I've repeated what other people have said, it's been because I've been down at the Finance Committee. Thank you, Councillor.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Durkin.
Thank you, Corla. And like other speakers, I want to compliment Deputy Eoin Murphy for bringing the bill forward for two reasons. Number one, it generates an occasion for debate on this particular subject. And two, it gives us an opportunity to speak in general on an issue that affects everybody in the country. Everybody who lives in this country, every citizen of the state is affected either in paying tax or receiving the benefit of tax that they have paid previously, or the tax that's been paid by the population in general. There are positives and negatives in relation to the particular bill as I see it. First of all, I totally and absolutely agree with the concept of transparency. I think it is hugely important that the voting public know where their money is being spent. And I had occasion recently at a meeting to hear a public representative say, in relation to the local authorities, that the local authorities provided no services at all. That's as far as he could see, and he was a member of a local authority. And I had the same person continue to say that when asked about public lighting, public footpaths, the VEC, the fire brigade services, all the other services that are in place and require ongoing maintenance, and they seem to be taken for granted. So there is absolutely, without any shadow of doubt, a need to illustrate quite clearly and emphatically what actually you get when you pay your taxes for whatever tax it is, whether it be income tax or anything else. I have serious doubts about the costs. Of presenting to individual taxpayers the setup, the breakdown of their taxes and where they go. Because there is always the danger that in the present economic situation that it will become divisive in society as well, in that those who say, well, I don't want to pay for that because that's costing me X, I don't wish to pay for that. And I wish to be selective. And I will now vote for a party to provide that. That could be divisive in our society. And we know, I remember not so many years ago in this House when we were told by a minister that we were a high-wage, low-tax society. Where did that get us? We have the illustration. So I think it could be extremely divisive and dangerous from that point of view. However, it is also hugely important that the voter relates their activity in the ballot box to the consequences of what they do in there. And I think that's where the transparency part of it comes in. I see no reason at all why the revenue commissioners or some similar body, in conjunction with the various government departments, cannot compile a diagram which shows the slice of the tax cake apportioned to each of the services throughout the country. And it costs very little. Only one division has to be done. In general, you take the total amount of revenue under the various services, total expenditure under the various services, for the various services, and you apportion it as a proportion of the total circle, as it were. And I think that would have the same effect. And it will particularly be beneficial to the voter, who now will be able to relate that to the policy of the various parties, including independents, who put themselves forward at election time. And there will be an opportunity for the voting public then to come to a conclusion. One very famous man, much more famous than any of us here, one time said that the voting tendency of the general public was in inverse proportion to their socio-economic status. And he was probably right. because there are those who have to vote very carefully for very valid reasons and make that decision on very profound grounds, where there are others may do it for frivolous reasons on the basis that it doesn't really matter anyway. So I think that I would thank Deputy Murphy for bringing this matter before the House in this fashion in order to give us an opportunity to discuss the pros and cons and to perhaps streamline it further in the course of further review and revision, and to try to relate, to try to bring to the people a focus on what we are really about. And it also helps to generate a debate on reality. Like reality. I have heard people in this House say, you know, the money will come from somewhere. Where does the money come from, for God's sake? And you know, there's no need for cutbacks and there's no need for austerity, as if austerity was a kind of a substitute for something else that was brought forward in order to punish people. That's not what it's about at all. It's about housekeeping, and housekeeping is hugely important. And nobody at the present in the present climate likes what has to be done. And I'm not going into even the business of blaming who caused it or whatever. It's here. We are here. And we have to work our way around what we have to play with in the future. And if we don't do that and we don't do it responsibly, then some future generation will come again and they will talk about us in a fashion that is less than complimentary. Thank you, Can Corley.
Deputy Phelan.
I'm almost loath to compliment Deputy Murphy. He's been getting nothing but compliments all morning. But I do commend him for bringing forward this particular bill. It's a very useful, I suppose, use of this opportunity for backbenchers to bring forward legislation, and there can be no more fundamental discussion than parliamentarians discussing information with regard to taxation and how people's hard-earned money is spent by the government, and anything that sheds a light on that is something that I fully support. There are certain aspects of the bill that I want to use my opportunity to comment upon, and also to echo some of the sentiments that have been expressed by some of the previous speakers. Indeed, Deputy Durkin in his contribution mentioned those people who believe and have expressed the opinion in this House and in other places that the monies to run the country will come from somewhere. I've heard similar expressions, and we all have over the last maybe 18 months in particular, but also before that. The basic duty of government, and it's certainly one that this government is acting upon, is to ensure that it lives within its means, and that we don't burden future generations with huge levels of borrowings which they will have to fund by living beyond our means at present. Unfortunately, that presents the Minister of Finance and the government with many difficult decisions in last December, and indeed in the weeks now in the run-up to this budget. But it is only right and proper, I believe, that the state should try to bring its books into balance and ensure that expenditure matches income insofar as possible. And that is the difficulty the government finds itself in. And I think this is a very useful discussion, and any light that can be shed and given to taxpayers, I suppose, in relation to the money that they contribute through the revenue commissioners to the coffers of the state, is to be very much welcomed. I would certainly say Deputy Durkin and others have expressed reservations about part of the legislation, and I mean that is certainly true, that people may decide, if such information was available, that they don't like particular aspects of where their taxes are being spent. But I would say that that's politics, and that their opportunity to not like where their money is being spent should be represented when they get into the ballot box to vote. And that really the purpose of this legislation is to ensure that those choices are presented clearly to people, and that's why I'm supportive of it. I'm also interested, although I'm not sure, I too must make a confession. I think it's the first time I've done so in this chamber, being a user of the dreaded tobacco weed, and Deputy Murphy has indicated that he in this legislation that the possibility of the provision of an online calculator for those of us not just who use tobacco, but other who spend money, which is everybody, on services and goods, and that there would be a reckoner of how VAT revenues and how much VAT revenue people contribute as well. I think that's a good idea. Certainly, as a smoker, I know I contribute a lot by way of duties and levies above and beyond what I contribute by way of income tax. I also want to, I suppose, maybe point out that in other jurisdictions, not least in the neighbouring one, they had this discussion very recently, where the Chancellor of the Exchequer was looking at, and I'm not sure if they introduced, and I didn't hear Deputy Murphy's opening contribution, whether they introduced legislation in line with what he is proposing here today, whereby full disclosure of where people's taxes are spent is actually now part of the law over there, but I'm aware that they did have that discussion at least about 12 months ago. And perhaps it's also worth pointing out, as the Minister did in his contribution, various initiatives that the government have taken since coming to office. The Comprehensive Expenditure Report, as outlined by Minister Howlin last year, and indeed the announcement earlier this week by Minister of State Brian Hayes in relation to Ireland's Stat, which would provide new information into the public domain, which hadn't been available heretofore. And I certainly think that discussions about legislation like this perhaps might prompt more disclosure by government departments and agencies into the future. I think it can never be a bad thing that taxpayers would have full information as to where the money that they contribute actually goes, and that's why I support this particular bill. Thank you.
Deputy Neville.
To speak on the bill and support the bill, and congratulate Deputy Murphy on his work on it. And of course, everybody has expressed the advantage of transparency in relation to our taxes, and that's very important. But I would just like to deal with another side of it as well, and that's the educational side of it, that the public would understand how the pressures come on for the allocation of taxation to different areas. And, we have, thankfully in Ireland, a very active civil society. We have a lot of organisations who lobby us, a lot of organisations representing a lot of interests in this country. But it's important, I believe, to know how the system responds to civil society and where it responds to civil society in regarding the demands of the various sectors of society. And, you know, coming up to budget, we are never more exposed to an understanding of how active civil society is in lobbying for itself, and rightly so. And I've seen some other countries where civil society was suppressed, and certainly, you know, the advantage that we have in relation to that is vital. And I just want to take an example of how of where things changed in relation to spending and pressures. In the 1960s, 20% of our total health budget was spent on the mental health services. Last year it was 5%. There was an erosion over that period without anybody almost being aware of it, and no discussion. You know, okay, in the 1960s one could say, and rightly so, the system was totally unacceptable with the mental hospitals, but then they moved people out to the community, but did not transfer the resources to support them. And, you know, a more awareness and awareness of that maybe at the time might engender discussion around the whole area of where money is spent. So I think it's important that we educate society about how decisions are made, are influenced. Decisions are made in the best interest of all society, but how they're influenced by civil society, and who are the strong people and who needs maybe more support because they're not as active. And if one people that are not as active in promoting their needs are those who suffer from mental illness, those who have suicidal people. And this week alone I met one person who told me two friends of his, a doctor and a pharmacist, had taken their life, and another person told me that a priest took their life this week alone. So all these issues go across society. So what I'm saying is Deputy Murphy's bill will facilitate more transparency, understanding, and an informative approach to society in how it's responding to how taxes are spent.
Thank you very much, Deputy. Deputy Feehan.
I would like to compliment and thank Deputy Murphy for bringing this bill into the House. I think it certainly is a great guide to not just the general public and the voting public, it's a great guide to politicians ourselves, because sometimes we're so engrossed in our own work that we don't really understand a lot of times where the funding is coming from or where the funding is going to. And when I look at health, you have 1/5 effectively of our contributions around the country to health. And I think it's a wake-up call of what exactly for the last 14 years the last government were just throwing money at a system and effectively were doing nothing about it. I saw in my own county in Roscommon where the government put about 7 to 10 million into building a new A&E in Roscommon. And they did that, and then they set up HICWA with the terms of reference to close it down. I remember going to a public meeting a year and a half ago, and an eminent man stood up in front of a meeting and he said, you know, all we want is an extra 10 million a year to keep the hospital open or the A&E open. And to huge applause. But I'd like to think where that gentleman thought where the money is going to come from, or why he felt that that 10 million should be put in to running an A&E which was simply unsafe and which HICWA was unsafe. And this is what we're dealing with all the time. You know, they give us more money, but they just simply don't understand that it's not money alone. It's actually the way you spend the money, and it's you want to get value for money. And I pay tribute to the Minister for Health, James Riley, with 1.7 billion out of the general budget in health. There are issues and there are problems, yes, but I think that and I pay tribute to the people on the front line, nurses, doctors, who actually have helped keep a system up and running with such reductions in the budget. And that has to happen because when this country's finances effectively fell off the cliff, it was this government who had to address a very, very serious situation. And if I just might say, I think that it's, you know, we've been living in denial for a long time regarding our finances. And I think this is a great kind of nearly Reader's Digest attitude to maybe seeing where our finances go. Just one last, I suppose, anecdote. I was flying home about 3 months ago from Germany, from Dublin to from Frankfurt Hahn to Knock. And on that plane, I would say 95 to 97% of the people on the plane were middle to upper income German people. And when Michael O'Leary won't want to hear this, but when the stewards went down with the trolley effectively of coffee and teas and sandwiches and beers, not one person bought a coffee or a tea, because they realise it's not good value. There's better value to be had instead of spending 20 euros on the plane with an hour flight. They can get better value or a better meal. But if that was a flight from London to Ireland with Irish people, we'd all be buying, give us a sandwich and give us a beer and give us a coffee, and we'd be using 20 euros or spending 20 euros. And effectively, it's not our, that's the, you know, when you see the German people where they can actually get value for money, is that we have to maybe now as a country to try to get value for money. And, you know, I know myself over the years, you didn't get value for money. I think now as a country and as a government, we have to. So I would like to compliment and thank Deputy Murphy for bringing this bill into the House. And I think that it's a very fair bill. Thank you.
Before calling the Minister, I just wish to give notice that the Select Subcommittee on Health has completed its consideration of the Health and Social Care Professionals Amendment Bill 2012, has made no amendments thereto. Minister.
Thank you very much, Ken Corla. I'd like again to compliment Deputy Murphy for introducing this bill into the House. And in principle, I agree with the provision of more information to members of the public, as indeed does everybody who contributed to this debate this morning. I see what the Deputy is trying to achieve, and I think it is laudable that further advances would be made. I want to note also the progress being made by my colleague, the Minister for Expenditure and Reform, in this area. I listed in my initial speech 5 major initiatives that he has undertaken to provide additional information to members of the public, and I know he's continuing on this path. The issue of public procurement was raised also in the course of the debate, and I think deputies may not be aware that a radical new consolidation and integrated approach to public procurement, including the establishment of a National Procurement Office, which will be headed by a Chief Procurement Officer, has been agreed by the Government. This planned integration of public procurement policy, strategy and operations, and the much greater level of centralisation represents a major strategic repositioning of public procurement and will lead to significant increases in both efficiency and effectiveness. I understand the concerns that have been expressed today by deputies and what has happened on occasions in this area in the past. Finally, the bill in due course will go to the Committee on Finance and Public Expenditure and Reform, and this will be extremely valuable in examining the practical constraints and identifying the possible unintended consequences of this legislation. But it will also provide an opportunity to advance the principle of the bill further and to ensure that we are right up there with other parliaments in providing the public with the kind of information which they now expect. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Minister. Now call on Deputy Eoin Murphy to reply to the debate.
Thank you, Ken Corla. And I'd like to begin just by thanking everyone, all deputies here and ministers, for the contributions that they made. I'd like to reply, and in summation, I'd like to touch upon each of the statements made by the deputies in the House. So if you'll bear with me, I had taken some notes, and I do hope I don't reflect anyone's position incorrectly in responding to the points that they raised. Deputy McGrath talked about the need for greater transparency in politics and in what the government is doing, and about making politics more relevant to people. And I think he's absolutely correct, and that's the purpose of this bill, to make politics more relevant and to make that connection clearer to people as to why they pay taxes and the great things that they get from their taxes, and then to help them partake in the debate and where they think the priority should be, and to do it in a more informed way. We talked about people being of the mind to go looking for the information themselves. Yes, some people are, but not everyone is. And as Deputy Griffin talked about, it's good for the government sometimes to be proactive and to go to the people themselves and say, look, this is what we're doing with your money, so they know, so they don't have to go looking for it. And also on that point, government finances are complex. When you look at the different documents, and we have published many, it can be difficult sometimes for the layperson. It's difficult for myself to wade through them and to find out exactly the information you're looking for. So anything the government can do to help in that regard, I think, is important. Deputy McGrath also talked about the P60 that was issued, as did Minister Noonan, and perhaps combining that statement in some way with what I'm trying to achieve here with this bill. I think that's a good idea. He talked about the level of detail that one would go down to, and that would be an interesting debate in committee, actually. What level of detail would you give under each subhead? How far down would you drill down into the numbers and give that information back to the citizen? I think it would be an interesting debate to have. Deputy McGrath raised concerns about maybe this perhaps being divisive, and he talked about those not paying tax, and was raised by a couple of other deputies as well. And this is where the second component of the bill comes in terms of the VAT and excise calculator, because of course everyone pays taxes. Not everyone pays income tax, but everyone pays taxes. And in fact, when we look at our VAT rates, they are quite high. And people do make a significant contribution to the public purse through their VAT on goods and on services. So that's where the second component of the bill aims to bridge that perception that it could be in some way divisive. People could then go and make an estimation of what they might have spent in the year on goods and services, take the VAT from that, put it into the calculator, and get the exact same breakdown as people would be getting on income taxes. He also mentioned the point about increases in VAT or bringing in a household charge, and the difficulty it is to bring people with you on those areas, and he's right. And that cuts to the core of the purpose of this bill, is that we want to keep people on board, and we want to tell them what we are doing, because we need them to support the government, and we need them to be a part of the difficult process that is currently underway. But I do welcome Deputy McGrath's contribution and his support for the bill. Deputy Doherty talked about a participatory government, a more participatory government, and that's exactly what this bill is about increasing participation from members of this chamber, both in the reforms that the Chief Whip has brought in and the ability to have the Friday sitting, but also in having the debate and feeding that debate into the process that the Minister has in his own department, doing that through committee and doing it in other ways. And that's what one hopes to achieve with these Friday sittings and why they are so important. As for the cost of the statement, if we were to issue a personal statement to everyone at their home, yes, I take that point, and it is something that we do need to examine. Deputy Doherty questioned the need for actually bringing in legislation, and people might already be aware that if they go onto the White House website, there will be a tax calculator there. They can put in a fictional or a notional amount of tax, because of course they don't pay taxes in that country if they're here, and they can get a breakdown as well, and they can see, for example, the amount of money that's spent on the United States nuclear weapon deterrent. They can do that, but as for the need for this legislation, again, it's about being proactive, but no one has done this before. The UK is moving to do this, but they haven't done it yet. So to have it on a legislative footing means it's not solely at the discretion of the Minister, and that might be important in years to come. So it is important to have the legislation. Again, legislation coming from a member of the Dáil as opposed to a member from the government is something different. It is unique, and it can show then an expression of support coming from the Dáil itself as distinct from the government, which I think is important. He talked about it being my first piece of legislation, and it being a strange priority for my first piece of legislation. It's not my first piece of legislation, it's my third. My first piece of legislation, the Smarter Transport Bill, is about bringing in new measures into urban transport, ways of getting around the city that would make it cheaper for people. I think that's important. Transport costs can be expensive. My other piece of legislation was about an ethical investment policy for the National Pension Reserve Fund. I think that's important because I think it's an important statement about who we are as a society. This is my other piece of legislation, tax transparency. And why it's important is because people are facing difficulties. Taxes are increasing, charges are increasing, the cost of living is up. There are new elements coming in, and people are struggling under these new burdens that are being imposed upon them. And it's only right that they can have full confidence in how we are spending their money and full transparency in what the government is doing. So when they see these new charges coming in, they support the new charges and they can see how that money is being spent. And that's why it's so important. In a way, it's fundamental to everything that we're trying to do. This whole transparency debate, not just my bill, but this whole transparency debate and the greater transparency that the government's trying to bring, it underpins all of that, everything that we are trying to achieve in making the big fiscal corrections that we are doing. But I do thank him for his support and for his party's support. He talked about including the cost of politics, politicians' pensions, and that is actually in the indicative breakdown that I gave for Jane Duffy of the €10,000 plus that she'll be paying in taxes in the year, income taxes. €13 was the price of democracy that you would pay for the Oireachtas and its members and everything else. And I think that's an important point to re-emphasise. Deputy Boyd Barrett talked about making comparisons year on year. And I think that is important. And that's where if you were issuing an actual statement, you'd be able to do that. People would keep the statement, as someone else referred to, because it would be with a government harp and they would find it to be important. And they could make those comparisons year to the year. I'm not sure if you would be able to do that with the online solution. It was something that we have to look at. Deputy Boyd Barrett as well talked about our debt as a country, and there is a line in the statement actually that covers the contribution that each person makes to the debt. But I would note that 75% of the debt that we have is general government debt. It is the cost of running the country over a number of years, and it is not banking-related debt. And every time we talk about debt, it's important to make that distinction. He also raised this idea about the taxpayer, and you might be creating this new privileged class, that those who pay taxes and therefore are paying for everything, and it would exclude others. Again, I've mentioned this previously. It's an important point to make, but I think the VAT and excise calculator would capture that because everyone does pay taxes and they would be included there. In committee, you mentioned that we might be able to discuss the possibility of providing more information. I think the more information, the better. The example of a pie chart giving down a breakdown of the tax structure, say between corporation tax and what's raised there, what's raised in income tax and everything else, yes, I think that's important. If, though, we were to give a breakdown in relation to the different taxpayers and who is paying tax at the different rates and what percentage that is, I would caution against that because I would find that divisive. The tax system is complicated, so is government finances, as I said earlier on, and hopefully this will shed some light and make our expenses and what we spend and our priorities as a government more accessible to people. We shouldn't be afraid of transparency, including the kind of information that Deputy Boyd Barrett was talking about in relation to tax reliefs or taxes foregone, and we shouldn't be afraid of the debate that would come from providing that information, because I think it could only ultimately help the government in the long run. But yes, this is about oversight and accountability, as you mentioned, and I do thank him for his support. Deputy O'Sullivan talked about fairness and the fairness debate, and yes, I think this could contribute as well. She wanted a reasoned debate about taxation, and she wanted to see that continue. I think that's very important. And hopefully this bill, in some way, if it were to be adopted and if this measure was to come through, even in the online calculator way, could help have an informed debate and help us really understand what we mean when we talk about fairness and what that means to each individual deputy in that debate, but also what it means to the people that they represent. Not everyone is computer literate, and I do take that point, and those rights do have to be recognised. We do need to have some statements for corporations, I think, and again, touching back on Deputy Boyd Barrett's point, why not provide that information in terms of a breakdown? I think it's an interesting idea, but I do welcome her comments, in particular her comments on a positive discrimination for businesses working in the domestic economy and doing what we can in terms of job retention. I think that's important. I'd like to thank the Minister for being present in the Dáil Chamber today. I am privileged that he is here to debate this bill. I thank him for his contribution, and I note and welcome all the transparency moves that he has made and the government has made to date. And I welcome him outlining the practical concerns that he sees, which I believe that could be addressed at the committee stage. We don't want to duplicate resources, of course. We would probably need to amend the bill so that we're talking about this is the tax that you paid last year and this is how we spent it, rather than using it as a forecasting tool around budget time. I do take that point on board. As for the online calculator interface, I'm not sure if it would require actually a secure portal. If you look at the example with the White House, people can go with their own information and just put it in and get the result. They wouldn't necessarily need to have this security or password system, but again, that's something that we could look at with people who are more, I suppose, technically inclined than I am. I do welcome the proposal that the P60, for example, might direct recipients to such a resource, that in issuing the P60 to people, you would say, well, if you want more detail as to how we have prioritised your spending, particular to the tax that you have paid yourself, go to this website, put in the information, and you'll get that breakdown back to you. But I do thank the Minister for his support, and I welcome his willingness to see this bill discussed at the committee stage. Deputy Griffin drew attention to the VAT calculator aspect on the website and the excise duty calculating method, and how that would include all taxpayers. Again, I think it's a very important point. We're not trying to be divisive. We want to give everyone a fair idea of how we prioritise the money that they're paying into the public purse, how we're spending it on their behalf. I think he's right to touch upon that important point. Deputy Kine drew correlation between the budget each year and how this might affect people's pay packet. And again, I think that's an important point here, because people could see how each budget directly affected them and their contributions to the public purse. So they could see over a period of time that trend. And when when an election was coming up, if they wanted to, if they were so minded to, and I think a lot of people would be, they could sit down and go, right, what has happened? How have government priorities actually changed? And they could get that information and that level of detail themselves. Deputy Lawler, just into his initial comment, said it was great to see a former NACE player getting the distinction tomorrow in relation to the Irish captaincy. I would note, I think it's important to note, that he now resides in Dublin South East, so we'll claim him as one of our own. He asked, people might ask, why should they pay if they saw this kind of information? People ask this question because they don't know what the money has been spent on. And I think the greater transparency we can give can help to answer those questions. I think it's right that people will ask questions, as Deputy Phelan talked about, and I think we shouldn't fear those questions, and we shouldn't be afraid to give the answers either. At the local level, we should draw a greater correlation between what is being paid and what is being delivered. And if we give local authorities proper revenue-raising powers, then we can hold them to account properly with this information and with this transparency. And when I talk about things like tax transparency, when I'm meeting people on the doors when they come into my office, it's often the level of local spend that they raise. You know, graffiti, why isn't it being cleaned up? Why are there potholes in the road? These kinds of issues. And that's where tax transparency can be more meaningful for them in their day-to-day lives and what's in front of them. But I think if we think keeping people ignorant as to what the government is doing with their money, if we think that will help us in what we're trying to achieve, I think we are mistaken. I think we should always favour information over ignorance, as I said earlier. Deputy Finian McGrath, I'd like to thank him for his support and for participating in the debate today. Deputy Deering supported the idea of issuing the letter, and I would know that the Minister mentioned the possibility of doing something with the P60 to Deputy Deering. I think that's welcome. He talked about buy-in from the public through this measure, and I think he's right. This is about involving people, including everyone in the corrections that we are making in terms of the budget, but also including them in the priorities that we have. Again, going back to Jane Duffy's statement, it's right that we're spending more money on primary education than on third level. That's our priority. People can see it in their own tax transparency statements there for themselves. If they want to then say, well, spend more, well, they can say that, but at least they're basing it on some sort of tangible element that's relevant to what they contribute. Deputy O'Donovan talked about social cohesion and exclusion, and again, I just note the point that everyone does pay tax, and the VAT calculator would try and calculate that contribution and give it back to people online. He mentioned the role of the Public Accounts Committee here and the work that it does, and I thank him for raising that, because this information, as I've said, is complex, it is detailed. Every week in, week out, the Public Accounts Committee is trying to drill down into the detail of how public money is being spent to make sure that it's being spent appropriately and efficiently. We do that. Not everyone pays as much attention as we would like. This would bring it in a proactive way, as Deputy Griffin said, back to the people. I would note as well, though, that of course that the Comptroller and Auditor General, as well as the Public Accounts Committee, could do with more resources. And again, in the tax transparency statement, where people see that only €13, for example, of Jane Duffy's €10,000 plus is going on the cost of Oireachtas, she might welcome an extra 20 cents if it would mean that the Public Accounts Committee might have extra resources, or indeed the government departments. But I do thank him for his contribution and for making the time to be here today. Deputy Harris raised the benefit that this could raise at election time, and I thank him for highlighting that aspect. It is very important. If you could put parties' proposals into this formula and give it back to the people, well, this is what, for example, and I'll take my own party, Fine Gael, is saying, and this is what it will mean in relation to how we're going to spend your contribution to the tax spend. I think that's really important. And I think that would bring an extra level to debate at election time that we haven't seen previously, and I would like to see that coming in. Deputy Hannigan talked about the costs, and he talked about the online element, and I think he made the point that we may not need a secure portal, and I think he's right in that, as I said previously. He also talked about extending the system to local authorities, and again, as I mentioned this earlier, he's absolutely right in that regard, and that's a place or a part of this where it could be incredibly important for the taxpayer. Deputy Martin Hayden talked about how people could twist this information, and of course they could, but I think he gave an excellent example of how you could twist it back. We mustn't be afraid of the tough questions, and we mustn't be afraid of giving the answers that we need to give. Deputy Humphreys, my constituency colleague, and I thank him for being here, talked about involving people more in the budget, the debate, and he gave a very good example of how he was doing that himself. And I hope that this transparency bill, this statement, if delivered, could help in some way. I think it's right that we have to cover local expenses too and give a proper breakdown. And I welcome his constructive contribution and his ideas, especially regarding the incremental change that we could see in bringing this bill about. We could start with a tax calculator online, and maybe in 3 years' time go to issuing a statement. We could start with 20,000 as we have, move to 15 and down like that. Deputy Durkin, I'd like to thank him for drawing the link between tax transparency and election pledges as well. I'd like to thank Deputy Phelan for his support and his considered contribution. Deputy Neville for his important points that he raised. And Deputy Phelan spoke about how in public finances we spend the money, and making that important distinction. This is how we're spending your money. And underlining that, I think it's an important point to show to people and to show them that our priorities as a government. I think that is really very necessary. And I'd like to thank Minister Noonan again. And I would note the great strides in transparency being made by the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform, Brendan Howland. It's important to note all the good work that the government is doing. And every contribution that was made today talked about that and talked about, even in this debate alone, trying to help what the government is doing, help in the debate about tax, help in the debate about budget, and help in the debate about transparency. As I said earlier, this is an issue we must continue to pursue. Open government is good government, and we shouldn't fear greater transparency, because greater transparency in public affairs delivers greater accountability, and with it better performance. And if we make government spending more digestible and more accessible to the individual, it will generate greater buy-in from people and strengthen the social contract. I would again like to thank everyone for their contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deputy. I now put the question that the bill be now read a second time. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Agreed. Tá an dul ar atlog the dóglog de March of Korea. Sorry? Oh. I didn't realise.
He has to read that out.
Sorry, I have to ask Deputy Murphy, it's my fault, I have to ask you to move that the bill be referred to the Select Subcommittee on Finance pursuant to Standing Orders 82A, 3A and 118 of the Standing Orders relative to public business and paragraph 8 of the Select Committee's Order of Reference.
I so move.
Thank you. Is that agreed?
Agreed.
Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you.